Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood motionless on the bridge of the flagship Yamato, watching the crimson sunrise paint the Pacific waters on June 4, 1942. Little did he know that within hours, this very dawn would mark not the beginning of Japan's greatest naval triumph, but the twilight of an empire's maritime dominance. The Battle of Midway was about to commence, and with it, the irreversible decline of Japanese naval supremacy that had ruled the Pacific for 6 relentless months. The Imperial Japanese Navy approached Midway Atoll with overwhelming confidence. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the first mobile fleet, spearheaded by 4 of Japan's most formidable aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. These floating fortresses had been the instruments of Pearl Harbor's devastation just 6 months earlier, their decks launching the planes that had crippled America's Pacific Fleet. Now they sailed toward what Japanese planners believed would be the final blow against American resistance in the Pacific. Behind this massive armada lay months of meticulous planning. Yamamoto's strategy was audacious in its scope. By seizing Midway, Japan would establish an impregnable defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. The tiny atoll, barely 2 miles across, held strategic importance far beyond its modest size. From Midway, Japanese forces could threaten Hawaii itself, forcing the remaining American fleet into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers would ensure victory. The Japanese fleet that morning represented the pinnacle of naval aviation technology. Each carrier housed experienced pilots who had honed their skills over China's skies and perfected their techniques during the lightning conquests of the Dutch East Indies, Philippines, and Singapore. These aviators were among the world's finest, their Zero fighters and Kate torpedo bombers having swept all opposition from Pacific skies since December 7, 1941. Yet unknown to Nagumo and his commanders, American codebreakers had penetrated the Japanese naval cipher. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had been working tirelessly to decode intercepted transmissions. Their breakthrough came when they identified AF as Midway's code designation in Japanese communications. This intelligence coup allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his forces with deadly precision. 3 American carrier task forces were converging on Midway, Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. Though outnumbered, these ships carried determined crews and increasingly skilled pilots who had learned hard lessons from earlier Pacific engagements. The stage was set for what would become the most decisive naval battle in Pacific War history. As morning mist cleared from Midway's runways, Marine and Navy pilots prepared their aircraft for the coming storm. Brewster Buffalo fighters and Douglas Dauntless dive bombers stood ready on the coral airstrips, their crews knowing they faced overwhelming odds. On the atoll's beaches, Marines manning coastal batteries scanned the horizon, searching for the first signs of the approaching Japanese armada. The sun climbed higher, its rays glinting off the wings of Japanese reconnaissance planes as they swept toward Midway. In those final moments before battle, both sides believed destiny favored their cause. The Japanese saw inevitable victory ahead, while Americans prepared to fight against impossible odds. Neither could foresee that this day would fundamentally alter naval warfare's very nature, making the aircraft carrier the ocean's supreme weapon while consigning battleships to supporting roles forever. At precisely 4:25 in the morning, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led 108 Japanese aircraft into the pre-dawn darkness, their engines thundering as they climbed toward Midway. The first wave consisted of 36 Kate bombers, 36 Valdive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters, a formidable force that had devastated every target it had previously encountered. As these aircraft disappeared into the Pacific sky, confident Japanese deck crews began preparing a second strike force armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs intended to destroy any American ships that dared venture into range. Meanwhile, Midway's radar operators detected the incoming formation at 150 miles. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as Marine pilots scrambled to their aircraft. 26 Brewster Buffaloes and 7 Grumman Wildcats rose to meet the Japanese onslaught, their pilots knowing they flew obsolete fighters against the Pacific's most experienced naval aviators. As reported in contemporary Navy Department bulletins, this desperate interception would prove tragically costly for American forces. The aerial clash began 30 miles northwest of Midway as Japanese Zeros tore into the outmatched American fighters. Within minutes, 15 Marine aircraft were shot down or damaged beyond repair. Major Floyd Parks, commanding Marine Fighter Squadron 221, died when his Buffalo exploded under Zero cannon fire. Captain Marion Carl managed to down one Japanese bomber before his riddled Wildcat limped back to Midway's main runway, smoke trailing from its engine. While fighters dueled overhead, Tomonaga's bombers pressed their attack against Midway's installations. The tiny atoll erupted in explosions as Japanese bombs struck the power plant, fuel storage tanks, and command post. Hangars disappeared in sheets of flame while Marines in foxholes endured the bombardment that had broken resistance across the Pacific. Yet Midway's runway remained operational, and its coastal batteries continued tracking the horizon for Japanese ships. At 700 miles northeast, Admiral Spruance received the electrifying message: enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 150, speed 25. This was the moment American strategists had awaited, Japanese fleet positions confirmed, with their aircraft away on strike missions. Spruance immediately ordered his pilots to man their planes, knowing this represented perhaps the only opportunity to catch enemy carriers vulnerable. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced his first crucial decision. Tomonaga radioed that another strike against Midway appeared necessary, reporting that American aircraft were still operating from the damaged but functional airfield. Simultaneously, Japanese scout planes were reporting conflicting information about American fleet movements in the area. The careful timing that had characterized Japan's previous victories began unraveling as Nagumo hesitated between competing priorities. The second wave of Japanese aircraft sat armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready to attack any American ships that appeared. However, Tomonaga's request for additional strikes against Midway forced a fateful decision. At 7:15, Nagumo ordered his crews to rearm the second wave with high-explosive bombs for another land attack. This process would require at least an hour that would prove decisive. American torpedo squadrons were already airborne, racing toward the Japanese fleet with outdated Douglas Devastators carrying Mark 13 torpedoes that frequently failed to explode. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet approached first, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. These 15 aircraft flew directly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire from the entire Japanese fleet, their slow, low-altitude attack runs making them easy targets for Zero fighters diving from above. One by one, Waldron's bombers fell into the Pacific under withering enemy fire. Ensign George Gay watched his squadron mates die around him before his own Devastator took fatal hits and crashed into the ocean. He would be the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8's gallant but doomed attack. Similar fates awaited torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown as Japanese defenders methodically destroyed the slow American bombers. Yet these sacrificial attacks accomplished something unexpected. They drew Japanese fighters down to sea level and scattered the enemy fleet's defensive formation. High above the carnage, American dive bomber squadrons approached undetected, their pilots searching for targets among the scattered Japanese carriers. The stage was set for the 10 minutes that would change naval warfare forever. At exactly 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted the Japanese fleet spread across the azure Pacific below. From 14,000 feet, The four enemy carriers appeared as tiny models surrounded by their protective screens of cruisers and destroyers. McCluskey had been searching for over 2 hours, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels, when a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward led him directly to Nagumo's fleet. This moment would prove to be the turning point not just of the battle, but of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable instant. Flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, aviation gasoline lines snaking across wooden decks, bombs and torpedoes stacked in neat piles. Everything needed for catastrophic destruction lay exposed under the morning sun. Nagumo's fighters were still at low altitude, having just finished massacring the American torpedo squadrons, leaving the sky above the fleet virtually undefended. McCluskey split his dive bombers, leading one section toward Kaga, while Lieutenant Dick Best took his squadron against Akagi. As the dauntless bombers rolled into their screaming dives, Japanese crews looked up in horror at the American aircraft plummeting toward them like metallic hawks. The first bombs struck Kaga at 10:24, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among the armed aircraft crowding the hangar spaces below. Simultaneously, Best's bombers targeted Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. A 1,000-pound bomb crashed through the flight deck near the amidships elevator, detonating among torpedo bombers loaded with fuel and ordnance. Secondary explosions rippled through the carrier's hull as aviation gasoline ignited in towering pillars of flame. Within minutes, Akagi transformed from the pride of the Imperial Navy into a blazing funeral pyre. 3 miles away, dive bombers from Yorktown found their target in Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led his squadron in textbook attacks that left Japan's third carrier mortally wounded. Bomb after bomb crashed through Soryu's flight deck, each explosion triggering larger secondary blasts as the ship's ammunition stores cooked off in the growing inferno. By 10:30, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks twisted metal and their crews fighting desperately for survival. The catastrophe unfolding before Japanese eyes defied comprehension. These carriers had been considered unsinkable fortresses, their experienced crews the finest naval aviators in the world. In 6 months of warfare, no enemy had successfully attacked them. Now, in less than 10 minutes, the backbone of Japan's naval air power lay broken and burning. According to wartime naval intelligence reports, this represented the single most devastating blow to any navy in modern warfare history. Captain Ryusaku Yanagamoto chose to go down with Soryu, strapping himself to the bridge as flames consumed his ship. Similar scenes of sacrifice played out across the burning carriers as Japanese officers followed ancient traditions of honor, even in defeat. Damage control parties worked heroically to save their ships, but the fires had spread beyond any hope of containment. Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, immediately launched a counterattack. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the American fleet, determined to exact revenge for his fallen comrades. At noon, these aircraft found Yorktown and pressed home their attack with the same determination that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. 3 bombs struck Yorktown, causing severe damage and forcing the abandonment of the carrier. American damage control teams worked frantically to save their ship, while Japanese pilots returned to Hiryu believing they had achieved victory. However, American dive bombers were already preparing for their own revenge mission against the last operational Japanese carrier. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, 24 dauntless bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu. The final Japanese carrier suffered the same fate as her sisters, bomb hits igniting the inevitable fires that would claim another proud ship. By sunset on June 4, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers, the heart of their striking power, in a single day's fighting. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the disaster from his distant flagship, realized immediately that Japan's naval supremacy had ended. The careful calculations that had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible now worked against him. Without carriers, Japan could not project power across the vast Pacific. The empire's expansion had reached its absolute limit at Midway's coral beaches. As darkness fell over the burning wrecks that had once been Japan's premier aircraft carriers, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto faced the most agonizing decision of his distinguished career. From the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, positioned 300 miles northwest of the disaster, he surveyed intelligence reports that painted an increasingly desperate picture. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, over 300 aircraft lost, and Japan's most experienced naval aviators dead or dying in the Pacific's depths. The magnitude of the catastrophe demanded immediate action. Yamamoto's first instinct was to press forward with the surface engagement he had originally planned. His battle line included Yamato herself, mounting 18-inch guns that could obliterate any American ship at extreme range, plus 2 additional battleships, 5 heavy cruisers, and numerous destroyers. Even without air cover, this force possessed enough firepower to devastate the American fleet if it could close to gun range under cover of darkness. However, Commander Minoru Genda, recuperating from illness aboard Akagi during the disaster, had managed to radio crucial intelligence before abandoning his burning ship. American dive bombers had demonstrated unprecedented accuracy and timing, suggesting enemy intelligence capabilities far beyond Japanese assumptions. The attack's precision indicated that American forces knew exactly where to find the Japanese fleet and when to strike for maximum effect. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, rescued from the blazing Akagi by the destroyer Nowaki, provided additional disturbing details. American pilots had appeared at the precise moment when Japanese defenses were most vulnerable, their fighters drawn down to sea level by the torpedo attacks. This coordination suggested not random luck, but careful planning based on superior intelligence gathering. As documented in post-battle Japanese naval analyses, this realization fundamentally altered strategic thinking about intelligence warfare. The human cost was becoming apparent as rescue ships picked up survivors from the burning carriers. Captain Jisaku Okada of Kaga reported that over 800 men had died when the carrier exploded, including most of the ship's experienced aircraft maintenance crews. These specialists, trained over years of intensive preparation, could not be quickly replaced. Without them, Japan's remaining carriers would struggle to maintain operational effectiveness. Soryu's survivors brought even grimmer news. The carrier's aviation fuel storage had detonated in a massive explosion that broke the ship's back, sending her to the bottom in less than an hour. Captain Yanagimoto's decision to die with his ship reflected not just personal honor but recognition that Japan's naval aviation had suffered irreparable damage. The institutional knowledge possessed by these veteran crews represented decades of accumulated experience that had died with them in the Pacific's waters. By midnight, Yamamoto reluctantly ordered the general withdrawal of all Japanese forces. The battleship engagement he had originally envisioned would risk the remainder of Japan's fleet without reasonable hope of strategic success. American land-based aircraft from Midway could attack his ships throughout the following day, while enemy carriers remained operational and dangerous. The arithmetic of naval warfare had shifted decisively against Japan. The retreat began under cover of darkness as Japanese ships turned westward toward home waters. Cruisers and destroyers formed protective screens around the surviving capital ships while rescue operations continued for carrier survivors. Each mile sailed away from Midway represented not just tactical withdrawal but strategic admission that Japan's period of Pacific dominance had ended. Hiryu, the last surviving carrier, continued burning throughout the night despite heroic damage control efforts. Captain Tomeo Kaku supervised the evacuation of his crew before ordering scuttling charges detonated to prevent capture. The ship that had launched the attack against Pearl Harbor's oil storage facilities now joined her sister carriers on the ocean floor, taking with her the dreams of Japanese empire that had seemed so achievable just 24 hours earlier. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2, chose to remain aboard Hiryu as she sank. His final message to Combined Fleet Headquarters reflected the profound shock that Midway's outcome had generated throughout the Imperial Navy. "I am alone and have no aircraft, but I am prepared to carry out another attack. I shall contact you again regarding the results." The admiral's death symbolized not just personal sacrifice, but the end of Japan's offensive capabilities in the Pacific theater. The strategic implications became clear as Yamamoto's staff calculated their losses during the long voyage home. Beyond the obvious material damage lay deeper problems that would plague Japanese naval operations for the remainder of the war. The carrier air groups destroyed at Midway represented Japan's operational reserve, the experienced pilots who formed the backbone of naval aviation training programs. The news of Midway's catastrophe reached Tokyo on June 6, 1942, sending shockwaves through the highest levels of Japanese government and military command. Emperor Hirohito received the initial reports in stunned silence, while Prime Minister Hideki Tojo immediately ordered strict censorship to prevent public knowledge of the disaster. The official narrative would claim a great victory, even as Japan's naval leadership privately acknowledged that their empire's expansion had reached its absolute limit. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, convened emergency meetings to assess the strategic situation. The mathematics were unforgiving. Japan had lost 4 large carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and over 250 aircraft in a single engagement. More critically, approximately 3,000 naval personnel had died, including irreplaceable pilots, aircrew, and maintenance specialists whose skills had taken years to develop. American losses, by comparison, were minimal. 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and fewer than 400 personnel. The ripple effects extended far beyond mere numbers. Japan's naval construction programs could not replace the lost carriers for at least 18 months, while training new air groups would require even longer. American industrial capacity, meanwhile, was producing new ships and aircraft at unprecedented rates. Intelligence estimates suggested that by late 1943, American naval strength would surpass Japan's even if no additional Japanese losses occurred. Captain Minoru Genda, one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, submitted a comprehensive analysis that painted an increasingly bleak picture. The tactical superiority that Japanese naval aviation had enjoyed since December 7th was eroding rapidly. American pilots were gaining experience and confidence, while improved aircraft like the Grumman Hellcat promised to challenge the Zero's dominance. Most alarmingly, American intelligence capabilities had proven far superior to Japanese estimates. The Doolittle raid on April 18th had already demonstrated American ability to strike the Japanese home islands, forcing the diversion of significant resources to homeland defense. Now Midway's outcome revealed that Japan's supposedly impregnable naval forces could be defeated through superior intelligence and tactical coordination. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership proved as significant as the material losses. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Third Fleet, privately warned that Japan's strategic position was becoming untenable. The Empire's conquests had created defensive perimeters stretching from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, requiring enormous resources to maintain. Without the carrier striking power lost at Midway, Japan could not simultaneously defend all these positions while maintaining offensive capabilities elsewhere. Emperor Hirohito's private concerns, documented in wartime diaries discovered after the conflict, reflected growing awareness that Japan's war aims might be impossible to achieve. The emperor had reluctantly supported the Pacific War, believing that quick victories would force American negotiation. Midway's outcome suggested that America possessed both the capability and determination for prolonged warfare that would ultimately favor their superior industrial resources. The human dimension of the tragedy became apparent as families throughout Japan received notification that loved ones were missing in action. The euphemistic language concealed the reality that most of these men lay at the bottom of the Pacific, their bodies consumed by the fires that had destroyed Japan's carrier fleet. Gold Star mothers across the empire grieved sons whose aviation skills had been honed through years of training that could not be quickly replicated. Naval flight training programs immediately expanded in desperate attempts to replace lost aircrew, but quality inevitably suffered as instruction time decreased. Young pilots who would have received months of intensive preparation now received weeks before assignment to operational units. This dilution of training standards would plague Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war, creating a descending spiral of decreasing effectiveness. The strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to American forces. Admiral Chester Nimitz recognized that Midway represented not an end, but a beginning, the opportunity to begin rolling back Japanese conquests throughout the Pacific. Planning immediately began for offensive operations that would exploit Japan's weakened naval position, starting with the Solomon Islands campaign that would further drain Japanese resources. Intelligence intercepts revealed growing pessimism within Japanese military circles. Admiral Yamamoto himself privately acknowledged to subordinates that Japan's prospects for victory had dimmed considerably. His prescient prediction that Japan could run wild for 6 months had proven accurate, but the window for decisive action had closed with the burning carriers off Midway. The war of attrition that he had desperately sought to avoid was now Japan's only remaining option, and the odds in such a conflict heavily favored America's industrial might. The strategic vacuum created by Midway's disaster became brutally apparent just 2 months later when American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Admiral Yamamoto, still reeling from the carrier losses that had crippled Japanese naval aviation, found himself unable to mount the massive counteroffensive that such an American invasion would have previously triggered. Instead, Japanese forces were compelled to fight a grinding campaign of attrition with resources they could not afford to lose. The irony was particularly bitter for Japanese planners who had envisioned Guadalcanal as a forward air base from which to threaten Australian supply lines. Construction of Henderson Field had been proceeding smoothly until August 7, 1942, when American Marines stormed ashore in the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War. Without the carrier air power lost at Midway, Japanese forces could not prevent the landing or quickly dislodge the invaders once established. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa attempted to compensate for lost air power through surface ship attacks, achieving tactical success at the Battle of Savo Island on August 9th. His force of heavy cruisers surprised and destroyed 4 Allied cruisers in a night engagement that demonstrated continued Japanese superiority in surface combat. However, strategic victory required holding territory, not merely sinking ships, and Mikawa lacked the sustained air support necessary to exploit his tactical triumph. The absence of experienced carrier pilots became increasingly apparent as replacement air crews arrived in the Solomon Islands. These hastily trained aviators, rushed through abbreviated training programs, lacked the precision and coordination that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. American pilots, meanwhile, were gaining combat experience while flying increasingly superior aircraft from Henderson Field's constantly expanding facilities. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, leading one of the few veteran fighter squadrons remaining after Midway, reported alarming changes in American tactical capabilities. Enemy pilots were no longer the easy prey they had been during the war's early months. The Grumman Wildcat, while still inferior to the Zero in maneuverability, proved far more durable in combat. American pilots had learned to use their aircraft's strengths while avoiding dogfights that favored Japanese fighters. The grinding nature of the Guadalcanal campaign exposed fundamental weaknesses in Japanese logistics that the rapid early victories had concealed. Supplying forward bases required sustained naval superiority, but without adequate carrier protection, Japanese supply convoys suffered increasingly severe losses to American air attacks. The famous Tokyo Express destroyer runs could deliver some supplies under cover of darkness, but these operations could not sustain major combat forces indefinitely. Admiral Isoroku Ozawa, now commanding Japan's remaining carrier forces, faced impossible choices in supporting Guadalcanal operations. His two operational carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, represented virtually the entire surviving strength of Japanese naval aviation. Risking these irreplaceable assets in the confined waters around Guadalcanal could result in their loss, completely eliminating Japan's ability to conduct carrier operations anywhere in the Pacific. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24th demonstrated these constraints clearly. Ozawa's carriers launched strikes against Henderson Field, but achieved limited results against well-prepared American defenses. Meanwhile, American dive bombers severely damaged the light carrier Ryujo, providing another reminder of Japanese vulnerability to sustained air attack. The engagement's inconclusive outcome reflected Japan's inability to achieve decisive results without the overwhelming air superiority that Midway had destroyed. By October 1942, Japanese casualties on Guadalcanal were mounting alarmingly. The island's jungle terrain favored defensive operations, allowing relatively small numbers of well-supplied American forces to hold defensive positions against larger Japanese attacks. Without air superiority to prevent American reinforcement and resupply, Japanese ground forces found themselves fighting an increasingly hopeless battle of attrition. The human cost was becoming apparent in Japanese units throughout the Solomon Islands. Malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition decimated troops who could not be adequately supplied due to American air dominance. Veterans of the Chinese campaigns, accustomed to rapid victory through superior tactics and equipment, now faced prolonged jungle warfare against an enemy that grew stronger while Japanese forces weakened through disease and starvation. Intelligence reports from Guadalcanal painted an increasingly grim picture for Japanese strategic planners. American forces were not merely defending Henderson Field, but expanding their perimeter and constructing additional airstrips. Each completed runway increased American air power while further reducing Japanese ability to operate in the region. The strategic initiative was slipping away as surely as Japan's carrier fleet had burned off Midway. Emperor Hirohito's private concerns, recorded in his wartime diary, reflected growing awareness that Japan's military situation was deteriorating beyond recovery. The emperor noted that battlefield reports increasingly emphasized American material superiority rather than Japanese tactical advantages. This shift represented a fundamental change from the war's early months when Japanese forces had consistently achieved victory despite numerical disadvantages through superior training and equipment. By June 1944, exactly 2 years after Midway's catastrophe, the full magnitude of Japan's naval decline became brutally apparent during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded Japan's rebuilt carrier fleet, 9 flat tops carrying over 400 aircraft, in what Tokyo hoped would be the decisive engagement that restored Japanese naval supremacy. Instead, the battle would demonstrate conclusively that Midway had been not just a tactical defeat, but the death knell of Japanese naval aviation. The quality disparity between opposing forces was immediately apparent. American Task Force 58 under Admiral Raymond Spruance fielded 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft, but numerical superiority told only part of the story. American pilots averaged over 300 hours of flight training before joining operational squadrons, while their Japanese counterparts often arrived with fewer than 100 hours. The institutional knowledge lost at Midway had never been adequately replaced. Admiral Ozawa's operational plan reflected Japan's increasingly desperate strategic situation. His carriers would launch maximum strikes against American invasion forces at Saipan while staying beyond the range of enemy counterattacks. Japanese aircraft would land at Guam's airfields for refueling before returning to their carriers, theoretically allowing sustained operations without exposing the valuable flat tops to retaliation. The plan's complexity revealed both Japanese tactical sophistication and their inability to achieve simple, overwhelming force. The battle began on June 19th with Ozawa launching over 300 aircraft in 4 separate waves against the American fleet. However, American radar systems detected each formation while still hundreds of miles away, allowing defending fighters to intercept the attackers with devastating effectiveness. The Grumman Hellcat had finally provided American pilots with an aircraft superior to the Zero in every performance category except range. Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighting Squadron 15 from the carrier Essex, exemplified American tactical evolution since Midway. His pilots used superior aircraft performance and coordinated tactics to systematically destroy Japanese formations before they could reach their targets. The thatch weave and other defensive maneuvers, perfected through 2 years of combat experience, neutralized the individual skill advantages that Japanese pilots had previously enjoyed. The slaughter was methodical and complete. Japanese formations that had expected to devastate American shipping found themselves torn apart by coordinated fighter attacks. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft launched that morning, only 130 returned to their carriers. American losses totaled 23 aircraft. As recorded in contemporary naval aviation news reports, American pilots began referring to the engagement as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, due to the ease with which Japanese planes were destroyed. The human cost extended far beyond aircraft statistics. Japan's remaining experienced pilots died in their cockpits over the Philippine Sea, taking with them the last vestiges of institutional knowledge that had made Japanese naval aviation formidable. The replacement pilots who survived were so poorly trained that many crashed while attempting to land on their own carriers, further reducing Japanese operational strength. Admiral Ozawa's carriers, despite launching massive strikes, remained virtually undefended as American dive bombers approached on the afternoon of June 20th. The roles had reversed completely from Midway. Now Japanese carriers lay vulnerable, while American aircraft approached undetected. The light carrier Hiyo exploded under bomb hits, while Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor, suffered severe damage that effectively ended their operational careers. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to both sides. Japan had committed virtually its entire remaining carrier force to the Philippine Sea engagement and suffered catastrophic losses without achieving any significant tactical success. American amphibious forces continued their Saipan operations undisturbed, while Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Emperor Hirohito's reaction to the Philippine Sea disaster, documented in recently discovered imperial archives, revealed complete comprehension that Japan's naval war was irrevocably lost. The emperor privately acknowledged that continued resistance would only increase suffering without achieving strategic objectives. However, military leaders argued that negotiation from weakness would result in harsher peace terms than fighting to the bitter end. The destruction of Japanese carrier aviation at the Philippine Sea represented Midway's logical conclusion. The institutional advantages that had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible, experienced pilots, superior tactics, and technological innovation, had died in the flames off Midway Atoll. 2 years of desperate attempts to rebuild these capabilities had failed against American industrial production and increasingly effective tactical doctrines. Admiral Yamamoto's pre-war prediction that Japan could run wild for 6 months had proven remarkably accurate. The empire's expansion had peaked exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor at the Battle of Midway. Everything since then had been managed decline, costly delaying actions that consumed resources Japan could not replace, while American strength grew exponentially. The last desperate gasp of Japanese naval aviation came during the kamikaze campaigns of 1945, when Admiral Takejiro Onishi transformed the remnants of Japan's air power into suicide weapons. This tragic evolution, from the skilled professionals who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack to young men flying obsolete aircraft on one-way missions, perfectly encapsulated how completely Midway's disaster had shattered Japanese naval capabilities. The institutional knowledge that had taken decades to develop was gone forever, replaced by desperate tactics that reflected strategic bankruptcy. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding the 5th Air Fleet, supervised the kamikaze operations from Kyushu with growing despair. His diary entries, discovered after the war, revealed that by early 1945, Japanese pilot training had deteriorated to the point where many aviators could barely fly their aircraft, much less engage in effective combat. The complex formation flying and coordinated attacks that had characterized Japanese naval aviation's golden age were impossible with such poorly prepared personnel. The contrast with American capabilities was stark and demoralizing. By 1945, the United States Navy operated nearly 100 aircraft carriers of various sizes, with pilot training programs producing thousands of qualified aviators annually. American industrial production had reached levels that Japanese planners had never imagined possible. New Essex-class carriers joined the fleet monthly, while aircraft factories delivered hundreds of planes weekly. The resource disparity that Admiral Yamamoto had feared was now fully manifest. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet operations from Pearl Harbor, could deploy task forces containing more carriers than Japan had possessed at its peak strength. Task Force 58 alone typically operated 15 fast carriers with over 1,000 aircraft, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in numbers that dwarfed entire Japanese fleets. American logistics capabilities allowed these massive formations to operate continuously for months without returning to base. The kamikazes achieved some tactical successes, damaging and sinking American ships throughout 1945, but these victories came at unsustainable cost. Each successful attack typically required dozens of aircraft to penetrate American defensive screens while achieving only limited strategic impact. The mathematical reality was inexorable. Japan was trading irreplaceable pilots for replaceable American equipment. Emperor Hirohito's growing desperation became apparent through intercepted diplomatic communications as Japan sought Soviet mediation for peace negotiations. The emperor privately acknowledged that continued resistance would only increase Japanese casualties without achieving meaningful military objectives. However, military leaders argued that unconditional surrender would dishonor the sacrifices made since Pearl Harbor, creating a deadlock that prolonged the war's agony. The final irony came on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that most Japanese civilians heard in shocked silence. Admiral Ugaki, unwilling to accept defeat, led a final kamikaze mission against American forces, his aircraft disappearing over the Pacific in a futile gesture that symbolized the complete bankruptcy of Japanese naval strategy. Post-war analyses revealed the full extent of Midway's strategic impact. Japan had lost approximately 60% of its experienced naval aviators during the four-day battle, creating an irreplaceable gap in institutional knowledge. American code-breaking capabilities, demonstrated so effectively at Midway, continued providing crucial intelligence throughout the remainder of the war. Most significantly, the initiative had passed permanently to American forces, who used their growing numerical superiority to conduct simultaneous operations across the vast Pacific theater. The human cost was staggering on both sides, but particularly devastating for Japan. Hundreds of thousands of skilled personnel had died in futile defensive battles, while Japanese civilian casualties mounted as American bombers reached the home islands with impunity. The naval aviation that had once projected Japanese power across the Pacific had been reduced to desperate suicide attacks that achieved nothing beyond prolonging national suffering. Admiral Yamamoto's pre-war warning about awakening a sleeping giant had proven prophetic. American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, had proven capable of replacing losses faster than Japanese forces could inflict them. The strategic calculation that had made Pearl Harbor seem reasonable, that quick victories would force American negotiation, had been shattered completely at Midway, leaving Japan to fight a hopeless war of attrition against impossible odds. The Battle of Midway had indeed rewritten naval warfare, but not in the way Japanese planners had envisioned. Instead of establishing Japanese dominance over the Pacific, it had marked the beginning of American naval supremacy that would shape the post-war world order. The carriers that burned off Midway had taken with them not just ships and planes, but the dreams of empire that had driven Japan into the Pacific War, leaving only the bitter reality of inevitable defeat and national devastation.